It took Rome 10 years to conquer Gaul and 50 to take Britain. But to conquer Hispania, it took 200. They arrived in 219 BC as liberators, promising freedom from Carthage. But they soon found gold, silver, and a reason to stay. What followed was a brutal two-century war of guerrilla tactics, legendary resistance, and betrayals that echoed all the way to Rome. This is the story of how a liberating force became a permanent master. The truth is, their arrival was never an act of goodwill. The arrival of the Romans on the Iberian Peninsula in 219 BC was not accidental. It was an invasion, pure and simple, though they dressed it in the noble robes of strategic necessity. Gaius, a simple legionary from Umbria, felt the grating of the sand beneath his colleague as he waded ashore, the salt spray crusting his face. He and 10,000 others had landed as a military force, their shields high and their gladi ready. Their orders were clear, barked by the centurion Marcus. We are here to root out the Punic sickness. Their enemies were the Carthaginians, the merchants of the sea, the followers of Baal, the existential threat to Roman dominance. Rome had already taken the islands from them, wresting Sicily, Corsica, and Sardinia from their grasp in bitter contests. So, Gaius had heard the veterans talk about the First War, a grinding, brutal affair that had left Rome the master of the waves. But here in Hispania, the Carthaginians were not island-bound. Sourced, they were well established, their influence spreading from their coastal cities deep into the interior. Juan, they drew wealth from the silver mines and recruited fierce local warriors into their armies. As long as the Barcid family held this land, as long as they controlled its resources and its manpower, they remained a dire threat to Rome's expansion, a dagger aimed at the Republic's heart. This was not a war of liberation. It was a war of extermination between two superpowers. The war in Hispania, the Second Punic War as the scholars in Rome would later call it, lasted for 12 agonizing years. Gaius, who had landed as a young man, felt the years carve lines into his face. He saw fields burned, villages allied with one side or the other, and alliances shift like the Iberian sun. He saw the brilliance of Scipio, a general who seemed to understand the Carthaginian mind better than they did themselves. And in the end, he saw the final expulsion of Punic power from the peninsula. The war was over. Carthago's time as a Mediterranean power was finished. The legionaries cheered. They would be going home. Or so they thought. The official narrative, the one spoken by the new governors and legates, was one of freedom. The Romans declared themselves the liberators of the Iberian tribes who had been under Carthaginian dominion. They held councils, signed treaties, and spoke of Roman friendship. But Gaius, now a junior officer tasked with mapping supply routes, saw something else. He saw the land. It was not just farms and pastures. He rode past mountainsides that seemed to weep metal, where the earth itself was rich with iron, silver, and the glint of gold. Sarkid, the commanders, once so eager to return to their estates in Italy, now spoke of opportunity.
Represents immense economic potential for Rome.
Nahardai, they soon realized the immense economic potential of the territory. Solwanam, the principle of freeing the natives from their Carthaginian lords was a useful story, but it was quickly replaced by a much more compelling one: the principle of permanent residence and its Romanization. Mysum, the talk of liberation faded, replaced by talk of tribute, taxes, and assimilation. Gaius looked at the proud, dark-eyed tribesmen who had fought alongside them against the Carthaginians. He saw their confusion turn to resentment. They had merely traded one master for another, and this new master had no intention of ever leaving. Rome's intentions were laid bare for all to see in 197 BC. This was no longer a military expedition. Born, it was an annexation. Maron, Rome made its intentions clear when it divided its conquered possessions into two formal provinces. Somon, the first was Hispania Citerior, a long stretch of territory running along the eastern coast and into the interior, the land Rome knew best. The second was Hispania Ulterior, further Spain, which encompassed the deep, wealthy south, the heart of the former Carthaginian domain. New governors arrived from Rome, men hungry for wealth, glory, and a triumph to launch their political careers. A debate lingered in the Senate back home. Was the expansion from the south and east into the rest of the peninsula a planned, deliberate act of state policy? Or was it, as many suspected, simply the result of the personal initiative of ambitious governors, men who provoked local conflicts to justify a glorious war? It was hard to be sure. But whether by design or by greed, the result was the same. Nanasit, the legions marched. Sakatron, they pushed west into the lands of the Lusitanians and north into the high plateaus of the Celtiberians. For the first time in its long, fractured history, almost the entire peninsula was controlled, or at least claimed, by a single power. The eagle has landed, and its shadow is spreading. Soirun, the land the Romans had come to conquer was ancient, beautiful, and profoundly divided. Sordi, the Iberian Peninsula, at the time of the Romans' arrival, was structured by tribal groups. This was not a unified kingdom. It was a mosaic of peoples, Ilergets, Turdetani, Lusitani, Celtiberi, each with their own language, gods, and customs. They were often isolated by the formidable geographical barriers of the land itself: high mountains, deep gorges, and arid plains that separated one tribe from the next. This fragmentation, among other things, made the Roman conquest easier. It was a bitter irony. Nakra, the very geography that bred their fierce independence, also prevented them from uniting. The tribes, in isolation, could not offer a cohesive opposition to the newcomers. Lar, Rome's ancient maxim, divide et impera, divide and conquer, was handed to them on a platter. Sacri, the methods employed by the Romans varied according to the circumstances, for they were masters of pragmatic cruelty. Meason, they knew how to exploit the disputes that already existed between the tribes. In the north, the Arabici might be convinced to provide auxiliaries for a war against their traditional rivals, the Vacae. In fact, some tribes actively conspired with the Romans to defeat their neighbors, hoping for favorable treatment from the new masters. Hickey, they would learn too late that Rome's gratitude was fleeting. Other tribes simply submitted, overawed by the disciplined legions and the brutal efficiency of Roman siegecraft. Some, they laid down their arms, offered tribute, and accepted Roman garrisons. And then there were the unyielding. The most defiant, those who clung to their freedom with a ferocity that stunned the Romans, were defeated in battle. Nara, their fields were salted. Their hill forts were burned. But this conquest was not the swift, clean affair of Roman propaganda. The Romans encountered enormous, unyielding resistance. It came especially from the Celts of the north and the northwest, people of the high plateaus and the green, misty mountains, whose spirit was as hard as the iron in their hills. The fight for the peninsula was not a war. It was a collection of wars, a slow, grinding, bloody occupation that lasted for almost 2 centuries. The Roman governors who came to Hispania expecting a quick victory and a triumphant return to Rome were often met with disaster. Legions were ambushed in narrow passes. Supply lines were cut. Garrisons were overrun. When we look at the 50 years it took to subdue the fierce island of Britannia, we see a long campaign. But 200 years, we can only conclude that the conquest of Hispania was uniquely harsh, prolonged, and bitter. So, we can divide this long conquest into several phases, with the first being one of the greatest expansions and simultaneously the greatest resistance. This was the era of the Scipios, but it was also the era of the natives who fought them. This first terrible phase of Roman domination culminates in 2 great deeds, 2 names that would be spoken in fear and awe in Rome for a century: the War of Viriathus and the Siege of Numantia. These were not just battles, they were legends, forged in fire and resistance. The first legend rose from the west, from the rugged hills of Lusitania. Nara. For about 10 years, from 147 to 138 BC, the Lusitanians, located in the west of the peninsula, waged an energetic and brilliant fight. They fought because they had seen their freedom, their very way of life, reduced to ash by the Roman invasion. And they fought under the command of a single leader, a man named Viriathus. Popular belief, the stories the legionaries told around their campfires, said Viriathus was a simple shepherd. He knew the paths of the mountains as a shepherd knows his flock. But this shepherd possessed organizational and military abilities that were nothing short of brilliant. He did not fight like the Romans. He did not meet them in neat lines on an open plain. He struck from the mist, melted into the hills, and turned the Roman strength into a weakness. Nasr, the Roman governor of Hispania Citerior, Servius Sulpicio Galba, had been frustrated by the Lusitanian resistance. He offered them a treaty. He promised them fertile lands if they would lay down their arms. The Lusitanians, wary but desperate, agreed. Some 8,000 Lusitanians were cut down. Viriathus was one of the few who escaped. The vile acts carried out by Galba were so treacherous, so beyond the pale, that they provoked angry condemnations even in Rome, a city not known for its squeamishness. And of course, they ignited the full, furious uprising of the Lusitanians. Viriathus became their vengeance. Employing classic guerrilla tactics, Viriathus caused immense damage to the Roman war machine. He moved his troops rapidly over vast areas of the southern and southwestern peninsula, striking at stretched supply lines and isolated cohorts. He would appear before a Roman force, feign a retreat, and then lead the pursuing, overconfident legionaries into a perfectly prepared ambush in a narrow valley. He defeated consul after consul, general after general. Rome, the superpower of the Mediterranean, was being humiliated by a shepherd. They sent their best, and their best were sent back in disgrace, their legions shattered. But Rome had one weapon that Viriathus could not defend against: treachery. If Roman steel could not defeat him, perhaps Roman gold could. His rebellion finally ended in 138 BC. Did not end in a glorious battle. It ended in a quiet tent. Two of his most trusted aides, his own companions, had been bribed by the Romans. They entered his quarters while he slept and finished their grim work. When they went to the Roman general to claim their reward, the story goes that the consul turned them away, saying, "Rome does not pay traitors," was a hollow, hypocritical claim, but the deed was done. The shepherd who had held the wolf at bay was gone, and the heart of the Lusitanian resistance was broken. The second great focus of resistance draws us to the northern part of the Meseta, the high central plateau, to the hill fort of Numantia, situated among the upper reaches of the Duero River. If Viriathus was the legend of the individual, Numantia became the legend of the collective. Numantia has become a legend, a story told and retold of ultimate defiance. The legend states that after a grueling siege of more than a year, its inhabitants, faced with unconditional surrender, chose a different fate. They preferred to set fire to their own city and end their own lives rather than become Roman slaves. It was a story of terrible collective pride. The story, however, is a little different from the legend. Tomoni, the reality as recorded by the Romans themselves, is more complex and perhaps more human. While there was indeed a long, agonizing siege, and some of the Numantines did die by their own hands, the truth is that the majority, starved and broken, eventually surrendered. About 50 of the leaders were sent to Rome to be paraded in a triumph, a spectacle for the Roman mob.
Grant them peace.
And the city itself, the symbol of Celtiberian resistance, was completely razed to the ground, its walls torn down until not one stone was left upon another. The conquest of Numantia certainly proved incredibly difficult for Rome. The siege had dragged on for years before the end. Roman armies were defeated, Roman commanders were outmaneuvered, and Roman prestige was on the line. Back in Rome, the senators were so enraged by their army's lack of success, by the constant stream of reports of failure and humiliation at the hands of these barbarians, that they decided to end it once and for all. Sorry, they sent one of their very best generals, Scipio Aemilianus. This was not just any general. Hannibal, this was the man who was already famous. The man who had raised Rome's greatest enemy, Carthage, to the ground in 146 BC. He was the destroyer of cities. And he came to Numantia with an enormous force, a terrifying display of Roman might. He brought with him 300 catapults, engines of war that could hurl massive stones to shatter walls and morale. He even brought 12 war elephants from Africa, beasts meant to inspire terror in the hearts of the defenders. But Scipio did not launch a direct assault. He had seen the strength of the Numantine defenses. Instead, Scipio isolated the city, surrounding it with a massive ring of palisades, towers, and ditches, a siege wall 7 miles long. Superway, he disconnected the city from the Duero River, cutting off their access to water and supplies. He did not try to take the city by storm. Suckered, the Numantines held out for months, enduring horrific conditions. Historica, the Romans triumphed materially. They had won the field and erased the city from the map. Cherulworm, but the legend preserved the name of Numantia as a timeless example of will and collective pride. Yes, they had lost the war, but they had won the story. The fall of Numantia marks the culmination of the first brutal period of the Roman conquest of the peninsula. With both Viriathus and the warriors of Numantia gone, the most organized and powerful resistance was broken. But this did not mean the end of hostilities. The various tribes, especially the Celtiberians in the northern highlands, were difficult to control and rebelled several times, sparking new, vicious conflicts whenever the Roman grip loosened. The land remained a proving ground and a graveyard for Roman legions. Second, the 1st century BC brought a new kind of chaos to Hispania. The problem was no longer just Roman versus Iberian. It was Roman versus Roman. Two great civil wars, vast conflicts within the Republic that spanned the entire Mediterranean, also washed up on Hispanic soil. The peninsula became a battlefield for ambitious Roman generals. Sertorius, a brilliant Roman exile, created a counter-Rome in Hispania, holding out for years against the official government. Later, the ultimate conflict between Julius Caesar and the sons of Pompey the Great saw its final, bloody battles fought near Munda in the south of Spain. The result of these brutal civil conflicts was the definitive end of the Roman Republic. The old system had torn itself apart. From its ashes rose a new one, the Roman Empire. And its master, the man who had won the final civil war, was Octavian, who would become known to history as Augustus, the first emperor. The rise of Augustus coincides with the second and final phase of the conquest of the Iberian Peninsula. After nearly 200 years, one part of the peninsula remains stubbornly, fiercely free. The Roman eagle now turned its gaze against the isolated Celtic tribes of the northwest, the Cantabrians and the Astures. These were peoples of the mountains, hardened by the wind and the cold. The Romans had left them alone for so long, not because they were respected, but because their lands were deemed too rugged and their people too poor to be worth the effort. But Augustus, the new master of the world, had two reasons to complete the conquest. Matthew I was prestige. He could not be the absolute ruler of the new empire and tolerate a pocket of barbarian freedom within a peninsula that was, by all rights, Roman. Second and more pressing reason was economic. Curie, the territories of the Cantabrian mountain range are immensely rich in minerals and gold. The empire needed wealth to pay its legions and fund its massive building projects. The Cantabrians were sitting on a treasury, and Augustus intended to have it. The Cantabrian Wars, as they are commonly known, began in the year 29 BC. They were not a simple police action. They were a full-scale, grinding, and savage conflict. For the next 10 years, the Romans fought a hard battle in one of the most rugged and unforgiving areas of the peninsula. Ararathan. This was a land of steep hills and narrow valleys, frequently humid and misty in the summer and buried in snow in the winter. The Roman legions, with their heavy armor and rigid formations, were at a total disadvantage. But it was not just the terrain. The Celts fought with ferocious guerrilla tactics and deadly ambushes, the same methods that had been so difficult for the Romans generations before. They would not meet in open battle. They would strike at night, isolating small patrols. They would roll boulders down on columns, marching through the passes. These were methods that were profoundly difficult for the Romans, who were accustomed to fighting in formation on open ground. The fight was so savage and so ferocious that Augustus had to convene 7 full legions, an enormous portion of the entire Roman army, to contain this one small corner of the peninsula. The casualties were so high and the progress so non-existent that the morale of the Roman soldiers was deeply shaken. Aruwansfan. They were veteran soldiers who had fought in civil wars and conquered Egypt, and they were terrified of the Cantabrian shriek that echoed through the hills before an attack. The persistence of Rome, however, finally prevailed. It was a victory not of superior tactics, but of sheer, overwhelming, and patient force. They built roads, established forts, and slowly choked the life out of the resistance, cutting off tribe from tribe. But it was not before the Emperor Augustus himself, frustrated with the reports of failure, had to depart for Asturias to command the army in person in 26 BC. He would not leave until the last spark of resistance was extinguished.